Have you ever seen a love so deep that people risk their life, their name, and everything they had? These aren't just love stories, they're scandals, sacrifices, and the most daring chapters in history. Oscar Wilde, Eleanor Roosevelt, Rachel Carson, 3 names, 3 secrets. Hidden from the world, but never erased by time. You're watching this right now because you love stories that shake the soul, so don't forget to like, share, and subscribe before we dive in. I'm about to take you into moments where love stood against the law, against society, and even against death itself. These are 3 true stories of a writer, a first lady, and a scientist whose love the world refused to accept, but whose hearts refused to let go. It began as a spark, a glance across a drawing room crowded with London's aesthetic elite, a fleeting exchange that would ignite into a conflagration. I was Oscar Wilde, the darling of society, the wit whose words drew gasps and laughter in equal measure, a comet flashing through the twilight of Victorian England. My plays and poems brought me adulation. My wife, Constance, and I had 2 young sons. My life, to any onlooker, was a tapestry of success. But in truth, it was incomplete, a painting unfinished, a chord unresolved, until I met him. Alfred Douglas Bosie to his friends was 21, golden-haired, petulant, and possibly beautiful. He entered my world in 1891, a sonnet in human form, brimming with confidence and the hunger of someone who knew both privilege and private anguish. He was the 3rd son of the Marquis of Queensberry, a poet himself, restless, reckless, and desperate for meaning. He approached me first at the Café Royal, where artists, actors, and philosophers gathered beneath the gaslight. I remember the way his eyes shone as he recited poetry his own, but also mine. He quoted lines from the Sphinx, his voice both trembling and defiant. He said my words had made the world new for him. It flattered me, of course it did. But it did something more. It called forth the parts of me I had hidden, the yearning, the loneliness, the longing for another soul who would see past my armor of wit and bravado. That night, we walked along Piccadilly, talking of Swinburne, Verlaine, Greek myths, the tension between the public mask and the secret self. The city seemed to pulse with our footsteps, the fog wrapping us in privacy. He asked me to dinner 2 nights later. I accepted. In Bosie's presence, I became both myself and more than myself, lighter, more daring, more alive. For the first time, I felt the thrill of being seen not as a performer, but as a man who could love. We began to see each other constantly. Letters flew between us, pages crowded with banter, longing, and a private language no one else could share. "My darling boy," I wrote to him, "it is a marvel that I have ever existed before I met you." He wrote back, "You are the only light in a dark world." At first, our relationship was a secret. There were codes, illusions, midnight meetings. But Victoria London was a city of secrets, a place where desire bloomed in the shadows, only to be trampled if it dared step into the sun. Yet I was reckless, so was he. Or perhaps we were simply hungry to exist as ourselves, even if only in stolen hours. I introduced him to my friends, to the circle of Uranian poets and artists who lived in perpetual exile within their own lives. We attended salons, the theater, strolled through Kew Gardens as lovers. He adored luxury, and I was eager to provide it: gifts, hotels, fine dining, the best of everything. But love is rarely simple, least of all ours. Bosie was, by turns, intoxicating and infuriating. He was impulsive, prone to sudden storms of anger, jealousy, or despair. Sometimes he would vanish for days, leaving me desolate and anxious, only to return with a flourish and a new poem, demanding forgiveness and more affection than before. His family loomed like a storm on the horizon. His father, the Marquis, despised what he saw as my corruption of his son. He sent threats, hired detectives, sent Bosie away to the country, tried to break us apart, But Bosie would not be contained. "Let him rage," he said. "He has never known what it is to love." But I knew the cost of such defiance. London could be cruel. Gossip was a currency. Every whisper, every sideways glance in a restaurant or club reminded me that our secret was never truly safe. Yet the more the world pressed in, the more daring we became. We traveled to Brighton, to Paris, to the south of France, always together, always watched. In those sunlit days, I glimpsed the happiness I had never believed possible. We wrote, we laughed, we dreamed of a world without judgment, a world where love might be free, might be as innocent as the laughter of children. But even as we carved out our moments of paradise, shadows lengthened. Bosie was extravagant, careless with money, heedless of consequences. He introduced me to younger men, ramp boys, friends who became lovers, then rivals. My own appetite for risk grew with his. Our letters grew fevered, desperate to dance on the edge of disaster. "Give me yourself to me forever," he once pleaded. "Not just your wit, not just your mind. I want your soul." And how could I refuse him? I loved him not as a father, not as a teacher, but as a partner, an equal in passion, if not in experience. But passion has its price. Our fights became legendary. There were nights of shouting, days of silence. I wrote the importance of being earnest in the heat of our romance. Its but a mask, its hidden meanings a secret language. Friends warned me, "He will ruin you," but I could not let go. There is a letter I wrote, which I never sent. In it I confessed, "I am made for loving you, but I do not know if I am strong enough to bear it." For I knew what Bosie was, a force of nature, dazzling and destructive, and I, for all my cleverness, was helpless before him. Our world narrowed, society's eyes grew sharper. The law section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act hovered like a sword. Bosie's father, furious, left a card at my club. To Oscar Wilde, posing as a sodomite, the word was enough. Enough to destroy a life. Bosie, wild with rage, demanded I sue for libel. I hesitated, knowing the danger. He insisted, how could I let his father win? How could I be a coward in the face of love? And so, blinded by pride, wounded by passion, I agreed. The trial that followed shattered everything. My love letters, once our secret, were read aloud in court. The love that dare not speak its name, now shouted for all to hear. Friends deserted me. The papers called me a monster. I was convicted of gross indecency, sentenced to 2 years hard labor. In prison, I thought of Bosie every day. I wrote him long, aching letters to Profundus, half plea, half elegy, half indictment. I told him how our love had undone me, but also how it had awakened my soul. I forgave him everything. I asked only for his memory to remain true. He wrote only once, a thin, brittle letter, full of blame and longing. By then, the world had turned against us both. And yet, what can I say? Even in the cell's darkness, even when all was lost, I cherished what we had been. I cherished the nights in Paris, the laughter in the Café Royal, the long walks through the city, the feeling of his head on my shoulder as we watched the Thames glimmer in the moonlight. Was it worth it? To love so recklessly, to lose so much? Sometimes I think it was the only thing worth anything at all. Would I ever see him again? Could our love survive the ruins of scandal, the cruelty of the world, and the wounds we inflicted on each other? Or was it doomed, from the first glance, to end in exile and silence? Prison changes everything. For 2 years, I, Oscar Wilde, lived behind iron bars, stripped of my identity, my words, and my world. The days were marked not by wit and laughter, but by labor, hunger, and humiliation. The cold stone of Reading Jail was a tomb for the self I had once performed in drawing rooms, theaters, and salons. It was also a crucible, a place where the old illusions died, and only the hardest, barest truths survived. Bosie, too, was outside, but it was as if we had both become phantoms haunting the ruins of our former lives. He was in Naples, then in Paris, then wandering the continent with the same recklessness as before, but now with a bitterness edged by shame. The world that had once tolerated our excesses now shunned us both. Invitations dried up, friends disappeared. His family cut him off, the Queensberry fortune reduced to a trickle. For months, I received nothing from him, no word, no letter, not even a whisper. I spent my hours in a tiny cell, waking before dawn, walking in circles, my hands swollen from the rough work, my thoughts gnawing at themselves in the endless dark. And yet, as much as I wanted to hate him, blame him for pushing me into the trial, for the reckless spending, the jealous rages, I could not. He was in a way my mirror, beautiful, broken, ruinous. We were both creatures of appetite and defiance, both seduced by the idea that love should be its own justification. But love does not shield you from consequence, it sharpens it. As the months passed, I wrote De Profundis a letter to Bosie that was part confession, part accusation, part elegy for all we had destroyed. I wrote of the wild beauty of our first days, the poison that crept in with lies and betrayals, and the final collapse under the weight of the world's judgment. I poured out everything I could not say aloud, the agony of longing, the madness of resentment, the way love, unchecked, had become a trap for us both. You came to me to learn the pleasure of life and the pleasure of art. Perhaps I am chosen to teach you something much more wonderful, the meaning of sorrow and its beauty. I do not know if you read it. Perhaps he did and could not bear to reply. Or perhaps he was as lost as I, exiled not just from England but from himself. He drifted through the south of France, squandering what money he could beg or borrow, spending nights in hotels, mornings at cafes, afternoons in a haze of longing and regret. Sometimes he would rage against his family, against the world, against me. Sometimes I heard he defended me passionately, as if in saving my name he could save a part of himself. Release from prison in 1897 was not freedom. It was a new kind of exile, public, humiliating, irrevocable. I left England with 2 suitcases and the ghost of a name that no longer opened any doors. My wife, Constance, had changed her name, moved abroad with our sons, and forbidden me contact. My plays were banned, my royalties seized. The society that once laughed at my jokes now crossed the street to avoid my shadow, yet I sought Bosie almost at once. What else could I do? Love is an addiction, a wound you keep pressing. We met again in Rouen, then in Naples, a reunion full of sweetness and disaster. For weeks, we lived together in a rented villa, hiding from creditors and scandal, laughing as we once had, pretending that nothing had changed. We dined by the sea, read poetry aloud, walked through old Roman ruins. But the old patterns returned: fights, silences, accusations. I begged for gentleness. He demanded adoration. The wounds of prison and poverty were still raw. Old friends wrote, warning me, he will destroy you a second time. Even Constance, from afar, threatened to cut off what little support remained if I did not leave him. We tried to live on nothing, but debts followed us. I pawned my last jewels. He pawned his last illusions. In time, the pressures, money, memory, the endless gaze of the world became too much. We quarreled one last time in a dingy hotel. He called me a coward, a fool. I called him selfish, ungrateful. Words that, in another age, would have been endearments, now curdled to venom. We parted in bitterness. He went to Paris, then to Normandy, then to nowhere at all. I remained a shadow in the sun, haunted by laughter that had turned to echo. For the last years of my life, I drifted through the continent, a faded celebrity, sometimes recognized, often pitied, always broke. My health failed. I lived on the kindness of strangers, the memory of applause, the lingering taste of forbidden love. Paris became my home, but it was a cold one. I wrote little. I dined in cheap cafes, still witty, still charming, but now with a sadness that colored every story. Bosie tried to build a new life. He published poetry, struggled for money, sued, and was sued. He married, briefly, but the marriage was loveless and ended in ruin. He too lived in exile, sometimes from the world, always from himself. Still, we could not fully let each other go. Letters passed between us, sometimes warm, sometimes bitter. There were rumors of chance meetings, of reconciliations never quite realized. Always, always the ache of what might have been. There was a day, late in 1899, when I saw him on the street in Paris. We paused, both unsure, both older. He smiled hesitant, no longer the golden youth, but a man carrying the same scars I wore. We spoke of nothing, the weather, the city, the plays I could not write, the poems he no longer believed in. And then he vanished into the crowd. What remains? I am dying now in a small hotel room with faded wallpaper and a single window onto a Paris street. By friends few but faithful visit when they can. I lie in bed, remembering sunlight on Bossy's hair, the sound of laughter in the Café Royal, the feel of his hand in mine. I think of all the words we spoke and all the ones we never could. When one is in love, one always begins by deceiving oneself, and one always ends by deceiving others. That was my line once. Now I wonder if it was the other way around. For all the ruin, the shame, the years lost, I would not trade our story. Not for comfort, not for fame, not for peace. Love is worth the price. Even love that destroys. I hope if he remembers me, it is not with anger. I hope he recalls the laughter, the poetry, the world remade by passion. I hope wherever he is, he forgives me for my failings. I hope I have forgiven him for his. Because love, in the end, is not about victory. It is about endurance, what survives after pride, after youth, after the world has done its worst. The world has forgotten us, perhaps, but I remember everything. Could I have lived differently? Could we have saved each other from the world or from ourselves? I do not know. I only know that I loved and was loved, and that is more than most can claim. Paris, 1900. My days are measured now, not by performances or applause, but by silence and the slow unraveling of the body. I am Oscar Wilde, once the brightest wit in England, now just a ghost in a foreign city, living out the last act of a tragedy written in the language of love. The room at the Hotel d'Alsace is small, dark, and smells of mildew. The wallpaper, a ghastly shade of green, seems to press in with the weight of unspoken regrets. I joke that I am dying beyond my means, but laughter is harder to conjure now. My friends Robert Ross, Reggie Turner visit as often as they can, bringing wine, laughter, and memories of a life that feels as though it belonged to someone else. I have no money. I have no country. My sons, Cyril and Vivian, live in another world. Their mother, Constance, is dead now, her last years spent quietly abroad, her spirit gentler than I deserved. The law will not let me see my children, but sometimes I dream of their faces, of their laughter in the gardens at Tite Street before everything was lost. But it is Bosie I think of most. In the years after our final separation, his presence lingered like the ache of an old wound. We exchanged letters, sometimes tender, often full of blame. He found religion, then rage, then reconciliation with his own pain. He wrote poems about me, about us, sometimes bitter, sometimes nostalgic. The newspapers, always hungry for scandal, wrote of our love as a curiosity, something sordid, something to be pitied. But they never understood what it meant to live in defiance. To burn for another soul with such intensity that you would risk everything for a single glance. There were rumors of reconciliation in Paris, a meeting in a cafe, a walk along the Seine. We sat together in silence, no longer young, no longer beautiful, but with eyes that still recognized the private country we had once inhabited. We spoke of old friends, of lines from Horace and Sappho, of the moonlit gardens where we first wrist touch. He asked me if I hated him. I said I did not. I never could. He asked if I forgave him. I said I already had. He asked if I loved him still. I said that love, once made, cannot be unmade. Not truly. Not in the heart's deepest cellars. But we were both weary, both changed. He could not forgive the world for our pain. I could not forgive myself for how easily I had let everything else slip away. We parted with a soft embrace, two exiles on the same shore, staring out at the darkness with hope and regret intertwined. My health declined quickly after that. The absinthe and cheap wine that numbed my loneliness now soured my blood. I grew thin, my hair silvered, my lungs rattled with each breath. The old magic was gone. Even my laughter, my most faithful armor, deserted me in the end. Yet in those last months, I found something strange: peace. I walked the boulevards in the early morning, unnoticed, free. I read Dante and listened to the music that had always moved me to tears. I wrote a little, mostly poems that would be found in drawers after I was gone. I lived among other outcasts, artists, drinkers, dreamers, men who loved men and could never say so. We shared stories in dim rooms, hands clutching cheap glasses, eyes bright with hope and pain. They called me Oscar and sometimes Professor. I became a kind of legend in exile, a cautionary tale and a secret promise. In November of that year, the pain grew sharp and constant. Robert Ross found me in bed, feverish, talking nonsense. He sat beside me for hours, holding my hand, telling stories of London, of the old days at the Savoy, of laughter and Lilith and the river that glittered at night. He brought me violets, my favorite flower. On my final morning, I awoke to rain tapping on the window. The room was dark but warm. I thought of Bosie not as the cause of my ruin, but as the source of my greatest joy. I thought of the letters we had sent, of the secret names we had given each other, of the times we laughed so hard that the world itself seemed to disappear. I asked Robert to write to Bosie to tell him I was not angry, to tell him that I wished him happiness, that I hoped he would write poems for someone new, to tell him that, even now, I would not change a moment. When I died, the news traveled slowly first through Paris, then to London, then across the world. The newspapers ran headlines: Oscar Wilde dead at 46, a talent wasted, a life destroyed. Some mourned, most did not. But for a handful of friends, and for Bosie, the world grew colder that day. Bosie lived on, haunted by our love. He married, divorced, quarreled with everyone, converted to Catholicism, wrote beautiful and bitter things. He never forgave my friends, never forgave himself, never forgave the world that had condemned us. But in his last years, he confessed at last that he had loved me as no one else ever had. He wrote in his memoir, "I see now that I destroyed him, but he destroyed me also. We were both wrong and both right. I loved him and he loved me, but fate would not have it. What in the end is left of our story? No house, no children together, no family portraits on a mantelpiece. Only words scattered, burnt, hidden in drawers and whispered in the dark, but the world remembers. They read the importance of being earnest and hear laughter hiding a broken heart. They read De Profundis and feel the ache of longing that no court, no cell, no age can suppress. They see two men daring to love, to lose, to endure, and to make beauty of their ruin. And they understand, perhaps for the first time, that love is never wasted, that the price is always dear, but the memory, if it is true, is eternal. In Père Lachaise cemetery, beneath a winged angel, my tomb bears only my name. Visitors cover it with lipstick, with poems, with tears. Some come in secret, some in pride. They come for what was forbiddance, for what was beautiful, for what was true. Bosie is buried far away in Sussex, his grave rarely visited. But sometimes someone leaves a single white rose. A gesture, a memory, a sign that the world has not forgotten what it once tried to erase. What does our story teach you, dear listener? That love is a kind of art at risk, a rebellion, a thing both tragic and sublime. It may break you, it may outlive you, it may never be safe. But if you are lucky enough to love, to be loved, then even in exile, even in ruin, you will have lived more truly than those who never dared. And that, I think, is worth everything. History remembers Eleanor Roosevelt as the tireless First Lady of the world, dignified, diplomatic, a champion of human rights and social reform. She was, to most, the public face of American compassion, a woman who turned the White House into a beacon of progressive change. But behind the photographs, the speeches, and the accolades lived a woman of longing and loneliness, whose greatest intimacy unfolded not in the glare of public life, but in the shelter of letters, thousands of them, written by hand to a woman history would almost forget, Lorena Hickok. Lorena Hick, as she was known, was everything Eleanor was not. Brash, tough, witty, a veteran reporter with no patience for society's pretenses. She'd grown up poor in South Dakota, survived abuse, earned her way as a journalist by pure grit and audacity. By the time they met in 1932, Eleanor was entering the White House as First Lady, uncertain of her role and her place beside Franklin's political star. Hick, covering FDR's campaign for the Associated Press, was jaded by politics, weary of men, and accustomed to moving through life alone. Their first encounter was awkward, a formal interview in Albany, New York, just after the election. Eleanor, shy and reserved, answered each question with careful dignity. Hick, direct to the point of rudeness, asked about everything but politics. What did Eleanor read? Did she ever wish she could be anonymous? How did she feel really about the campaign trail? Something passed between them in that small room, something unspoken but unmistakable. Eleanor later wrote in her diary that she had never felt so completely seen. Hick, in a letter to a friend, said, "I thought she'd be a prude. She's nothing of the sort. She's quick, dry, funny, and so much lonelier than I expected." The friendship grew fast. Hick became Eleanor's confidant, her beloved friend. The public called it companionship, but their letters betray a deeper hunger. Eleanor would wait up late for Hick's phone calls, pacing the White House corridors with her hair unpinned, her shoes kicked off, nervous as a schoolgirl. Hick would tease her, challenge her, break through her polished mask with jokes and irreverent questions. By the inauguration, they were nearly inseparable. Hick traveled with Eleanor across the country, seeing the America that most politicians ignored: shantytowns, mining camps, segregated schools, and rural farms scarred by the Dust Bowl. Together, they witnessed the poverty of the Great Depression, the hope and despair that shaped a generation. Hick reported what she saw to FDR, but it was Eleanor's presence, her warmth and empathy, that changed lives. Their relationship was an anchor in a world of constant motion. Franklin, charming and preoccupied, was often distant, a president more than a husband. The White House, with its endless parties and protocol, could be a cage for a woman who craved authenticity. But with Hick, Eleanor found laughter and solace. They wrote letters, sometimes 3 or 4 a day, full of private jokes, confessions, longing. Eleanor's handwriting grew more hurried, more intimate, the more she wrote. She called Hick darling, dearest, my heart. Hick called her old stiff, my little one, the person I love most in the world. There were rumors, of course. Servants noticed that Hick's room in the White House was always close to Eleanor's. Friends whispered about the nights Eleanor would slip away from dinner parties, leaving Franklin to the cigars and conversation, just to walk with Hick in the garden, arm in arm under the magnolias. But in those early years, it was enough simply to be together. They had a kind of room of their own, a world outside the world, where the First Lady was not an icon, but a woman, and the reporter was not an outsider, but a cherished companion. Sometimes they would escape to Valkill, Eleanor's cottage in Hyde Park. There, away from the press and the pressure, they could cook together, read aloud, sit by the fire until dawn. Hick would tease Eleanor about her stubbornness. Eleanor would read Hick poetry until she fell asleep. Theirs was a tenderness learned in defiance of the world, a privacy snatched from the jaws of public scrutiny. But even in those precious hours, shadows gathered at the edges. The world was changing. The New Deal, the rise of Hitler, the specter of war all drew Eleanor back into the public sphere. And Hick, fiercely independent, resented the compromises required by proximity to power. Their love would soon be tested, not just by history, but by the cost of visibility, the impossibility of ever being fully seen. Could two women so different, so bound by loneliness and longing, find room for themselves inside the machinery of history? Or would the pressures of duty, secrecy, and the public eye tear even the strongest bond apart? Washington, 1933 to 1945, the city of monuments, marble, and perpetual scrutiny. The White House glowed each evening with the cold light of expectation. Every window another eye, every corridor another echo of secrets. In this palace of duty, love, especially love between two women, was a dangerous thing. Eleanor and Hick had built something rare and precious. But as the world's needs grew larger, so did the space between them. Eleanor's days became longer, more public, traveling the country for the New Deal, launching press conferences, standing at the front lines of reform. Every week brought new crises, breadlines, lynchings in the South, labor strikes in the North, and soon enough, the drumbeat of another war. Hick was there, always at first. Her job with the Associated Press was her badge and her shield. She chronicled Eleanor's rise with the wry detachment of a woman who'd seen too much to be impressed by power. Yet beneath her brisk dispatches, she saw what few others did, the cost of being America's conscience. The exhaustion in Eleanor's eyes, the longing for simple kindness in a world that demanded miracles. But even in love, there is no hiding from history. As Eleanor's influence grew, Hick's place in her life became more complicated. The press watched. The administration bristled. Franklin, never jealous but always political, began to feel the threat, not to his marriage, which was long ago hollowed out by infidelities and secrets, but to the smooth running of his presidency. Too many questions, too many rumors, too much truth. Eleanor was determined not to let Hick go. She lobbied for her to receive a special government post, arranging for Hick to become chief investigator for the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. Hick traveled across the Depression-ravaged nation, sending back thousands of field reports notes on the hunger and hope she found in coal towns and migrant camps, each one ending with a personal postscript for Eleanor alone. "Miss you, wish you were here, love always." They still wrote constantly long, hurried letters on White House stationery, coded but unmistakably intimate. Hick would arrive late at night, exhausted from a train journey through the Dust Bowl, only to find Eleanor waiting with tea and a smile that melted the fatigue from her bones. But the world would not leave them alone. Whispers grew louder that Hick was more than a friend, that she was the First Lady's shadow, her companion, her roommate. Political opponents seized on the relationship, using it to undermine Eleanor's reform agenda and paint her as weak, improper, unfeminine. Even among progressive circles, there was discomfort. A woman who dared to love so deeply, so openly, became an easy scapegoat when things went wrong. Hick, always tough, felt the sting. She began to retreat emotionally first, then physically. Assignments took her farther afield, the South, the West, places where her only company was the sound of her typewriter and the memory of Eleanor's arms around her at Valkill. She missed the quiet nights by the fire, the feeling of being known and safe. She missed being someone's beloved, not just someone's reporter. Distance opened the cracks that had always been there. Eleanor grew more consumed by the demands of public life. She could not give Hick what she needed, the full devotion of a partner. Hick, used to forging her own path, bristled at being a kept woman on the margins of history. Her pride warred with her longing. She loved Eleanor with all her battered heart, but she hated the constant waiting, the way their moments together had to be stolen, always second to some larger cause. The letters change too. The early ones are breathless, full of endearments, longing, little complaints. About aching backs and cold feet, requests for locks of hair, secrets meant for no one else. But as years pass, the tone grows more brittle. Hick's complaints are sharper. Eleanor's reassurances more forced. There's still love, but now it's threaded with doubt and fatigue. Eleanor writes, "It is very difficult to live always feeling the pressure of the world. Sometimes I wish I could slip away and never be found. Only with you do I feel I can breathe." Hick replies, "I know you love the world, but sometimes I wish you loved me more." The war years put even greater strain on their bond. Eleanor traveled to England, the Pacific, even the battlefields of Europe, bearing witness to suffering that dwarfed her own. Hick was assigned to cover the home front. Their letters became lifelines, dispatches from the front lines of loneliness, reminders that even in chaos, love endures. Once, after months apart, Hick wrote, "I have never been so alone, not even as a child. I wish I could curl up beside you and let the world fall away. But I know it can't be. Not for us." Eleanor, receiving this, wept. She penned her reply on thick White House stationery. "You are in my heart every hour, every minute. Nothing can change that. Not war, not the world, not even time. But love is not always enough." By 1945, the strain was showing. Hick's health failed, exhaustion, depression, the toll of a life lived out of a suitcase. She resigned from government work, retreated to a small house in Hyde Park. Eleanor, now the widow of a nation, poured herself into public service as never before, leading the UN's Human Rights Commission, traveling the world as the face of post-war hope. Still, they wrote, though less often, less urgently. The spark that had once threatened to burn down the White House had become an ember, flickering but never quite extinguished. Friends noticed that Eleanor kept Hick's letters in a box by her bed. She read them in the quiet hours, sometimes smiling, sometimes weeping. At Valkel, visitors sometimes found her staring at the hills, lost in thought. "You look like you're waiting for someone," a friend once teased. She replied, "I suppose I always aim." Hick, for her part, never loved anyone quite the same way. She wrote a memoir, wry, unsparing, full of the heartbreak of loving a woman the world wanted only as a symbol. She refused to be cast as a victim or a scandal. "I knew who she was," she wrote, "and I loved her all the same." What do we make of a love lived mostly in letters, in hotel rooms, and the margins of power? What does it mean to love someone who belongs, ultimately, to the world? Could their bond, tested by distance, secrecy, and history itself, survive to the end? Or was theirs the fate of all impossible loves to endure in memory, in words, and in the secret rooms of the heart, long after the world has turned the page? There is a kind of love that never becomes a household story. Not the kind sung in ballads or carved in stone, but the sort that lingers in the letters locked in a desk drawer, the glances exchanged in crowded rooms, the names spoken quietly on sleepless nights. That was the love Eleanor Roosevelt and Lorena Hickok carried into the long years after the White House, as the world both remembered and forgot them. By 1945, Eleanor's life was outwardly busier than ever. Franklin was gone, felled suddenly by a stroke in Warm Springs, Georgia, leaving a nation in mourning and a wife caught in a peculiar grief. Their marriage had been a partnership, but never truly a romance. Franklin's death was an ending, but not the kind that closed all chapters. For Eleanor, widowhood did not bring solitude. Instead, it brought a kind of freedom. She was no longer required to play the part of First Lady. She could travel where she wished, take up new causes, throw herself into work. She became the world's conscience, the architect of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, an ambassador, a speaker, a writer. Crowds still came to see her now out of genuine admiration, not mere obligation. But when the applause faded and the crowds dispersed, Eleanor's true solace was found not in public duty, but in quiet rooms and old habits, a cup of tea, a walk at Valkill, a stack of letters bound with blue ribbon, and always, always the memory of Hick. Hickok had retired from government, her health battered by years of relentless travel and the heartbreak of never quite belonging. She bought a small house in Hyde Park, close enough to Valkill that a phone call or a short drive could reunite the two women in the twilight hours. But life by now had changed them both. Hick, once the sharp-tongued journalist, was softer, slower. She spent afternoons on her porch, reading mystery novels, sometimes writing, sometimes staring out at the Hudson, lost in memories. Eleanor would visit whenever her schedule allowed. She brought books, news of the world, sometimes a basket of fruit or fresh-cut flowers. Their time together was rarely dramatic, just two women talking quietly, remembering old journeys, laughing about the past. Sometimes Eleanor would read aloud from the letters they had exchanged during the war, both wincing at the rawness, the vulnerability, the hunger in those words. Other times, they simply sat in silence, watching the shadows lengthen across the fields. Yet, even as their love changed shape, less urgent, more reflective, it never quite dimmed. Hick was the only person who could tease Eleanor out of her public seriousness, who could draw out the playful girl beneath the stateswoman's mask. She would remind Eleanor of the way she used to sneak chocolates into White House meetings, or the time she slipped out of a formal dinner to dance barefoot in the rose garden. Eleanor, for her part, was the only person who could persuade Hick to let down her guard and simply rest. Theirs was a companionship forged in adversity, a partnership that survived not just the prying eyes of the world, but also the more subtle dangers, jealousy, resentment, the aching knowledge that, in another world, they might have had a different kind of life together. There were still moments of pain. Hick would sometimes accuse Eleanor of loving the world more than any one person. Eleanor would remind Hick, gently, that her love was not divided, but multiplied by all she gave to others. Eleanor remained a public figure in demand everywhere. She traveled abroad, Paris, London, Geneva, sitting at the table where the world's future was debated. She met with kings and revolutionaries, children and refugees, always with the same humility and care she had shown in the poorest corners of Depression-era America. In every city, she sent postcards to Hick, sometimes just a sentence or two, arrived safely. The rain in Geneva reminds me of our walks at Valkill. Missing you. Other times, long confessions about loneliness, frustration, the yearning for a home that was never truly hers except in Hick's company. Meanwhile, Hick's world grew smaller. She published a memoir candid, unsparing, full of admiration and longing for Eleanor, but careful never to betray the privacy they had fiercely guarded. She faded from public view, becoming a local figure in Hyde Park, remembered for her wit, her stories, and her loyalty to a love that never made the history books. There were holidays spent together, birthdays marked by quiet dinners, and always, always, letters now yellowing, their ink fading, but their words still fierce. As the years passed, Eleanor's health began to fail. She tired more easily, her famous energy sometimes giving way to quiet spells of reflection. She was still in demand, still writing, still meeting the world's needs, but she grew less inclined to chase every cause, more likely to savor the small mercies of home, a favorite book, a friendly face, the comfort of Hick's presence. In 1962, after a short illness, Eleanor died in her bed at Manhattan's Presbyterian Hospital. Her children, grandchildren, and friends were there. So was Hick, who held her hand in the final hours, murmuring old stories, reading aloud from their earliest letters, reminding Eleanor of who she had been before the world called her great. After Eleanor's death, Hick slipped quietly into obscurity. She lived another 5 years, outlasting her beloved by just long enough to arrange her letters, to write her final words, to make peace with a world that had never truly accepted the depth of what they shared. At Eleanor's funeral, the church was crowded with the mighty and the humble presidents, diplomats, activists, former first ladies, and the ordinary men and women whose lives she had changed. Hick sat near the back, dressed in black, her eyes dry but haunted by a grief that no eulogy could name. She kept the box of letters until the end. When she died in 1968, she left instructions for their preservation, not for scandal, but for truth. It would be decades before scholars would piece together the story hidden in those thousands of pages, a story of longing, of courage, of two women who dared to make a life together in the margins of history. What was their love in the end? Not a marriage, not a public romance, but a quiet defiance, a promise to see and be seen, even when the world refused to look. It was Hick who said it best, late in life, in a letter she never sent. "We lived as best we could, my dear. We loved as much as the world allowed, and perhaps that is all any of us can do." Their legacy is not written in marble or carved in public memory, but in the private courage of hearts that refuse to be less than true. Love, in their story, is not about victory or acceptance. It is about persistence, the decision to reach across the boundaries of history and hold fast, no matter how quietly, to what matters most. In the turbulent America of the early 1950s, as highways carved up forests and pesticides dusted every field, a scientist named Rachel Carson lived quietly in the suburbs of Maryland. Her world was one of discipline and solitude. The sea, her research, the whisper of typewriter keys long after midnight. Her work as a marine biologist and writer for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had earned her quiet respect, but she moved through life with the caution of someone who knew her difference could never be spoken aloud. Rachel was not alone in her isolation. The world expected little warmth from women like her, serious, unmarried, too dedicated to men's work. She'd learned to bear the loneliness, to pour her longing into her studies and her writing, and to walk the fine line between presence and invisibility. Then, in the summer of 1953, she bought a cottage on Southport Island, Maine. It was a weathered house perched above tidal rocks and spruce, a place where the wind tasted of salt and wild blueberries. It was meant as a retreat, a place to write in peace. She had no idea it would become the setting for the deepest connection of her life. Dorothy Freeman was a schoolteacher from Massachusetts, a wife, a mother, known for her fierce intelligence and gentle humor. She and her husband Stan had retired to Southport, seeking quiet and renewal in the island's slow rhythms. Dorothy loved birds and wildflowers, kept detailed journals, and possessed a mind so wide and curious that she and Rachel, upon first meeting, recognized each other at once as kindred spirits. Their friendship began innocently shared walks along the rocky shore, afternoons gathering shells, long conversations on weathered porches about literature, science, and the unspoken poetry of the natural world. Dorothy was drawn to Rachel's quiet depth. Rachel, for her part, was moved by Dorothy's warmth and curiosity. They wrote letters, hundreds of them, even when only a few houses apart on the island. Those letters at first were full of ordinary details, birds seen, books read, clouds on the horizon. But quickly, the correspondence deepened. Words became a lifeline, a bridge between hearts unable to speak their longing aloud. The letters grew more intimate, more confessional. "I feel such peace with you," Rachel wrote, "as if the world were just beginning." By summer's end, they were inseparable. Rachel would leave Maine in autumn, returning to her work in Washington, but the mail brought her back to Dorothy's side every day. Each letter was a private world, safe from scrutiny. They invented pet names, secret codes, and a language that only they understood. Rachel signed her letters always Rachel. Dorothy signed hers with Love, D. Their connection was never simple. Dorothy was married. Rachel, a public figure whose career now depended on her credibility and discretion. Their love, whether romantic or simply the rarest form of soul friendship, could not be named. Yet it became the center of both their lives. They confided everything: hopes, fears, memories, the ache of parting at the end of each summer. They planned their days around stolen visit stays in the woods, nights watching the tide, moments that made the world feel manageable again. It was Dorothy who encouraged Rachel to write the book that would become Silent Spring, to speak truth to power, even at the risk of attack. "You are not alone," Dorothy wrote. "Your voice is needed, and it is loved." Rachel, bolstered by this unwavering support, set out to challenge the chemical giants that threatened the very world she cherished. But even as the world closed in critics, corporations, the mounting pressure of fame and controversy, their letters remained a sanctuary. In every storm, every sleepless night, Dorothy's words were Rachel's anchor. They never spoke openly of their love. How could they? The world was not ready to listen. But in every page, in every shared walk, in every hour spent watching the sun set over Maine, something brave and beautiful endured. Could two women, living quietly in the margins, change the course of history? Could a love unspoken but fiercely felt be enough to weather the tempests ahead? Or would the cost of secrecy and sacrifice prove too high, even for hearts as steadfast as theirs? The world was changing, and Rachel Carson felt it in her bones. It was not just the slow ticking of her own body exhaustion that would not ease, the private ache of illness she told almost no one about, but a deeper disturbance, a shift in the wind, the silence that was falling over fields where birds no longer sang. As the 1950s turned toward their close, the cost of progress was everywhere. DDT spraying in the air, slicks of chemicals on the rivers, a green world growing ghostly. She was writing more than ever, piecing together the fragments of her next book between government reports, interviews with scientists, and long late-night sessions at her kitchen table. It was Dorothy who steadied her through these days, Dorothy, whose voice on the telephone could soothe her nerves better than any medicine, whose letters, arriving faithfully, reminded her that the fight was not hers alone. But distance, as always, pressed hard against their closeness. For most of the year, Rachel was in Maryland or Washington, working in near constant secrecy. Her professional life was a delicate dance, the only woman in rooms of men, the only voice speaking out when silence would have been safer. She could not afford scandal. She could not afford distraction. And yet, every morning, she wrote to Dorothy before breakfast, before the world's demands, before the first phone call or meeting. In return, Dorothy sent news from Maine, the first robin of spring, the new wildflowers blooming by the path, the everyday miracles Rachel missed most. The letters grew longer, more necessary. In them, they admitted things they could not say in person, the depth of their longing, the pain of parting, the secret wish for a world where they could simply be together without explanation. Rachel called Dorothy her heart's own, her beloved friend, her anchor. Dorothy, in turn, confessed that her days felt incomplete without Rachel's words. "I count the hours until your next letter," she wrote. "I feel most myself when I am with you, even if only in thought." As Rachel's manuscript took shape, so did the threat. The chemical industry was powerful, vindictive, and eager to crush dissent. Colleagues warned her to be careful. Anonymous letters and phone calls began to arrive. She felt the risk, knew that her reputation, her career, and perhaps even her safety were at stake. But what frightened her most was the possibility of losing Dorothy's faith. They had always lived in parallel. Dorothy's marriage, her family, her public role as teacher and wife were boundaries Rachel tried not to cross. Their love, whatever its form, was always just outside the world's notice, a whispered promise, a private courage. But as Silent Spring grew nearer to publication, Rachel worried that the coming storm would wash everything away. She wrote to Dorothy, "If I lose you, I lose my own strength. It is your faith that lets me keep going, even when the night feels endless." Dorothy replied with characteristic steadiness, "You have not lost me, and you never will. Let the world do as it must. We are our own shelter." The summer of 1962 arrived hot and heavy, storms rolling across the Atlantic. Rachel came to Maine as soon as she could, arriving in the night, exhausted, but smiling at the sight of Dorothy waiting on the porch with a lantern and an open door. Their reunion was quiet, almost shy. Years of longing distilled into a gentle embrace, an evening spent side by side with no need for words. Days on the island were a respite, walks in the woods, tea on the porch, time measured by the tides. They watched osprey diving for fish, counted stars, read to each other from old favorites. Rachel seemed lighter here, her laugh, always rare, coming more easily, her eyes less shadowed. But the peace was brief. Rachel's illness grew harder to ignore aches and fatigue that would not leave, a weight in her chest that sometimes made even walking a struggle. She confided in Dorothy, who listened with a depth that was more than sympathy. It was solidarity, a shared bearing of burdens. They talked for hours about the book, Rachel's fears, the attacks she knew were coming, the possibility that her voice might not be enough. Dorothy argued back that truth could not be unwritten, that the world needed what only Rachel could give. Silent Spring was published in September 1962. The response was explosive. Praise from scientists and conservationists mingled with fury from corporations and politicians. Rachel was called a liar, a hysteric, a threat to progress. The White House demanded hearings. Chemical companies launched campaigns to discredit her. She endured interviews, testimony, personal attacks, all while growing weaker, sicker, more fragile. Dorothy was her refuge. Every night, a letter, a phone call, a quiet affirmation. "You are not alone," Dorothy wrote again and again. "I am with you, always." But the price was high. Rachel became increasingly isolated. Friends withdrew. Even some colleagues hesitated, afraid of the controversy. Her family, her adopted son Roger, her nieces did what they could, but Rachel's most intimate thoughts remained for Dorothy alone. In their letters, the world shrank to the space between two hearts. Rachel confessed her fears of dying, not of pain or oblivion, but of leaving the work unfinished, of leaving Dorothy bereft. Dorothy, for her part, wrote of her own loneliness. Her sense of living in two worlds, one with you, one without you, and only the first feels real. Their meetings grew less frequent, each one more precious. A week together on the island in late summer. A long walk down to the water, Rachel stopping often to rest, Dorothy holding her hand. Evenings spent reading aloud, sometimes in silence, sometimes in tears. Rachel's last autumn was golden, the maples flaming, the bay full of migrating geese. She wrote to Dorothy, her handwriting shaky but defiant. "I am not afraid, so long as you are with me. Remember the birds, the tide, the place that is ours. Remember me there, and I will never be far." As her health failed, Rachel found comfort in routine, the morning letter to Dorothy, the evening cup of tea, the memory of laughter under the Maine pines. Dorothy called every day, visited when she could, sent gifts, books, flowers, little things that said, "I see you, I love you, I am here." The world for a time receded. There was only the sea, the island, the words shared in secret. What do we owe each other in the end? To bear witness. To stand by even as the storm comes. To love even when love is only allowed to exist in the quiet and the margins. In the space of a letter never meant to be read by anyone but the one who matters most. The winter of 1963 was cold and interminable along the mid-Atlantic coast. Rachel Carson's cottage in Maryland, once so full of manuscripts, letters, and the steady rhythm of typewriter keys, grew quiet except for the low hum of the radio and the shuffle of slippers along the hall. The world outside was in turmoil, the Cold War, the civil rights struggle, the endless debate over what kind of progress was worth the cost. But for Rachel, the battle had narrowed to the boundaries of her own failing body and the private hope that her final work might outlast her. Dorothy Freeman, ever faithful, sent letters nearly every day. Sometimes just a note of memory, a bit of news about the weather in Maine, a quote from a favorite poet, a reminder that the sea was waiting. Sometimes the letters were longer, full of encouragement, small confessions, or the questions that only she could safely ask. In those dark months, Dorothy was both mirror and anchor. Her words brought the world back into focus when pain blurred the edges of Rachel's days. Rachel's health was failing rapidly. The cancer that she had tried to keep secret for so long had spread, sapping her strength. She was often bedridden, relying on a small circle of friends and family, but her mind was sharp, her resolve undimmed. When she was able, she worked on her last articles, answered letters from admirers and critics, and always wrote to Dorothy. Sometimes at night, she wrote one February evening, "I hear the wind in the pine trees and imagine you beside me, reading in the lamplight, your hand in mine. You are the peace the world cannot give." Dorothy, in return, sent descriptions of the spring thaw, the first crocuses, the slow retreat of ice on the bay, the return of the chickadees. She wrote of small joys and aches of neighbors and family, but mostly she wrote of love. "There is not a day," she confessed, "that I do not think of you, your courage, your laughter, the way you have taught me to see." Their love, never named, was understood. It was a presence in the room, a pulse behind every ordinary gesture. When Dorothy was able to visit, she came quietly, entering with a basket of books, a thermos of soup, and the gentle humor that could coax a smile even on Rachel's worst days. They talked for hours of books, of birds, of memories from their first summer on Southport Island. Sometimes they sat in silence, content to let the clock mark the passing of time. Rachel worried about the world she was leaving behind. She feared for Dorothy, for Roger, for the sea itself. She wrote instructions for the stewardship of her house in Maine, asked friends to look after the osprey nests along the shore, and insisted, even as her body weakened, on editing new editions of Silent Spring. But in the quiet hours, her heart was always with Dorothy. The final days arrived in early spring. Rachel, now frail and often sleeping, still kept a notebook at her bedside. Dorothy visited, reading aloud from their favorite books, C.B. White, Emily Dickinson, Wordsworth. He had described the sunlight on the water, the smell of earth after rain, the small green signs of hope that Rachel had always taught her to notice. Rachel's last letter to Dorothy was short, a single page, the handwriting shaky but unmistakably hers. "My dear, if I could have lived 1,000 years, I would have chosen you in every one. Remember the woods, the tides, the mornings before sunrise. All that we shared is safe. I am not afraid. Always, Rachel." Rachel Carson died on April 14th, 1964, in her home in Silver Spring, Maryland. News of her passing made headlines around the world. She was hailed as the voice that awoke a sleeping world, the writer who had changed the fate of nature itself. Presidents and scientists, students and activists all paid tribute. The New York Times called her gentle and fierce, solitary and brave. But the tributes that mattered most came quietly, in letters and notes to Dorothy. from those who knew the truth, that Rachel's courage had been sustained by a love the world would never fully understand. Dorothy, grieving but resilient, returned to Southport. She kept Rachel's letters in a cedar box, reading them when the world seemed too loud, too empty. She walked the old paths they had traveled, watched the tides roll in, tended the garden, and wrote long letters to herself, part journal, part prayer, part ongoing conversation with the woman she had loved most. As the years passed, Dorothy dedicated herself to preserving Rachel's legacy. She hosted students, activists, and scientists at the cottage, telling stories of Rachel's gentleness, her stubbornness, her unerring eye for beauty. She resisted every effort to make their love into a scandal or a spectacle. When asked about the letters, she would smile and say, "They are the story of two women who believed in each other and in the world." It was Dorothy's steadfast care that protected Rachel's legacy from distortion. The letters remained, archived and unread for decades. Only much later did scholars realize the truth, that beneath the formal prose and coded language was a love as real, as ordinary and as extraordinary as any history had ever known. In her last years, Dorothy wrote often to Rachel in her mind. Sometimes, she said, she could still hear her voice on the wind, feel her presence in the hush before dawn. On Rachel's birthday, she would bring wildflowers to the shore, place them where the waves could carry the petals out to sea. She died in 1978 at the age of 82. Her ashes were scattered on Southport Island, not far from Rachel's beloved cottage. There, in the salt and sun, in the hush of pines and the cry of the osprey, their story found its rest. What remains of a love that lived mostly in silence? Not monuments or parades, but the quiet courage to care, to persist, to make beauty even when the world could not name it. For every activist who plants a tree, every child who watches a bird take flight, every scientist who dares to speak truth to power, there is a debt owed to two women who found in each other the voice to change the world. Love is not always a shout or a vow. Sometimes it is simply a promise kept year after year in the quiet heart of the world. Sometimes it is all the things left unsaid, the letters kept in a cedar box, the certainty that we are never really alone so long as we remember and are remembered by the one who saw us truly. If these stories touched your heart, hit that like button, share this with a friend, and tell me in the comments. What does love truly mean to you? And don't forget to subscribe, because the most dangerous love stories in history are still to come.